to you, he will surely not lose his reward. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
This morning I'd like to talk about the first reading from the Old Testament, from the book of Kings, and use that as a jumping off point. It's sometimes difficult to understand what exactly is going on in our Old Testament reading, our first reading, because we're usually like parachuted into the middle of a story without any context. Because the Old Testament reading is chosen thematically to align with the gospel. And so today, the gospel says, if you receive a prophet, you'll receive a prophet's reward. And that's what we hear about. So let me just fill in the picture a little bit more. There's this prophet whose name is Elisha, and he is the successor to the prophet named Elijah, which makes it very challenging to keep track who we're talking about. But the prophet Elisha, he was traveling around, and this lady says, "You can stay at my place," and so he stays several times with her, and then he decides, "I should do something for you." And his servant tells him that this woman and her husband have not had a child, even though they are getting on in years. And so the prophet Elisha, he says to her, "This time next year you will have a child." And that's where the story ends in our reading. But it continues, and she says, she kind of questions that based on her history. But sure enough, next year she has a child. But then the story takes another turn, and after a while, that child dies. And then the prophet Elisha shows back up, and he brings that boy back to life. And that's how that story ends. But I think there's a couple of points in here that we can take home. First of all, that every child is a gift from God. We see that the child in this story is the fruit of the prophet's prayer to God. And so we know that every human life is very valuable, and it is very important. And every life is good because it is chosen by God. And this is something that we should always tell people. It is good that you exist. Your life has meaning. Your life has purpose because God has called you to life, not by chance, but because he chose to. And that's really important. So I want to read a few things from the Catechism of the Catholic Church today. So it talks about how a child is a gift. And because a child is a gift, strictly speaking, there's no right to have a child. Even though they are good, there's no, because that would be treating them like possessions. Instead, it says that children possess genuine rights. The right to be the fruit of the specific act of the conjugal love of his parents, and the right to be respected as a person from the moment of his conception. So children are indeed a gift. The other thing that we hear about in this reading is the difficulty of infertility. And we know that this was rather common because there's lots of stories in the Bible about people that were infertile, including the parents of John the Baptist, Zechariah and Elizabeth. But there's many other examples too. And for couples that experience this, it is a very challenging cross to bear. It is a challenge in their life. It is something, there's a great suffering. And this is what the Catechism says. Couples who discover that they are sterile suffer greatly. And then it quotes from the Bible, Abraham asks of God, "What will you give me? For I continue childless." And then Rachel cries to her husband, "Give me children or I shall die." And so it is truly a very difficult thing for couples. And there is a natural desire for children because that is what marriage is for. It is for bringing children into the world and raising them. And so it is important to desire that. But we have to be careful today about some temptations to use unacceptable means to do that. And today, the most common way is in vitro fertilization, or IVF. And I just want to make two remarks before I say a little bit more about that. First of all, as I said, every human life, no matter how that life came into the world, has a great dignity and importance. The morality of the act of conception tells us nothing about the dignity of the child. And we can think of other examples too. And oftentimes, couples enter into these things by ignorance, because they don't know the ethical qualities of these things. And that's why I want to speak about this today, because we want to form consciences to make good moral choices. And so the principle here is that since human life has such a great dignity, then the transmission of life also has a great dignity, and it has a plan by God for how that is to take place. And so the problem with IVF is that it is like a manufacturing human life. Instead of conception occurring in the mother, it takes place in a laboratory in a petri dish, and it can lead to manipulating human life, and then most tragically, it leads to the destruction of human life, because more human embryos are created than are to be born. And so it is very tragic. And lastly, there also creates this situation that if some of those human embryos are frozen or cryogenically stored, then we have this moral dilemma. Now what do we do? And we want to avoid that as much as possible. Fortunately, there are good alternatives to this. And the Catechism specifically says that research aimed at reducing human sterility is to be encouraged, on condition that it is placed at the service of the human person, of his inalienable rights, and of his true and integral good, according to the design and will of God. And all throughout this country, there are Catholic doctors and scientists that are working hard to help couples to bear children. There's a place in Omaha, Nebraska called the St. Paul VI Institute, and that's their specific goal. And it's called NAPRO technology, and there's doctors trained in this. And so it is a good alternative. The Catechism goes on to say, spouses who still suffer from infertility after exhausting legitimate medical procedures should unite themselves to the Lord's cross, the source of all spiritual fecundity. And they can give expression to their generosity by adopting abandoned children or performing demanding services for others. And so all of us are called to bear the cross of Christ in our life. And so how should we support couples that are infertile? We should pray for them. We know that that prayer is very powerful. That's what we heard in the reading. We should support them with our friendship, our love, and also with the truth. And so St. Paul tells us today that in our baptism, we died and rose with Christ. And so we are to think of ourselves as dead to sin and living for God in Christ Jesus. And that means, as Jesus said, taking up our cross and following after him, even if that is a heavy cross. And so we should bear our cross as well with the grace of God and help other people to bear their cross as well.